The next kind of thing we're going to be doing here, like I said, that I kind of mentioned, is we're going to be tier ranking of these Big 12 coaches. If anyone's never seen a tier list, we've got it ranked A, B, C, D. I've got Scott Frost at the bottom. Just a little spoiler alert there. This is not necessarily, I'm not going to necessarily rank them within the tiers and say like, oh, in the first person in tier B is the best tier B coach or anything like that. I'm just going to put them into their bin. The way we can kind of define this is that, so tier A is the cream of the crop of the conference. It's, I mean, self-explanatory. They are the best coaches in the conference based on either resume or what's going on. B is they're good, they're a respected coach, but maybe they need to show just a little bit more to really vault themselves into that tier one conversation. C is a, kind of just a, they're kind of just treading water. They're floating along a little bit, and maybe, maybe they could jump up maybe they could jump up one tier or something like that, but you're not necessarily incredibly hopeful for that. So it's kind of a, we'll have to wait and see type of thing. D tier is this coach is struggling. Something isn't quite looking right. Maybe they're at disadvantage. Maybe they've had just kind of some bad seasons early on, do some various luck or whatever, but in general, not necessarily a favorable look on this coach. Not necessarily a candidate to get fired, but just a coach that's got a long ways to go to really move up as far as the desirability rankings go. And that's kind of how I want to rank these two, is based on, it's a combination of what have we seen so far and what do we think we can get from them in the future. Now, what can we get from him in the future is usually a different conversation, because there's guys, if you look at we'll talk about him, like a guy like Mike Gundy, who's been there forever. His resume speaks for itself. He has an A tier resume for sure. But going forward, how desirable is he as a coach for anyone in the conference? We'll have to figure that out. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to Mike Gundy. Um, so that's how I want to do this. For anybody that has seen tier lists before, you'll notice that there is not an S tier at the top there, and that is for a reason. And that is because I believe that S tier is reserved for like guys that are in the conversation as the best coach in college football. And right now, I think you've got like probably one guy in Kirby Smart, maybe a couple other ones, like maybe Dabo, maybe Ryan Day, but otherwise, there's not a lot of I'm leaving the S tier for a type of coach that I don't think is in the conference right now. And I don't think in the F tier I'm going to leave, because I don't think there's anybody. I don't know that there's anybody on the chopping block as like this year, where like if this year, goes not that well, that they're just immediately gone. I don't know that there's anybody in the conference that's in that kind of position necessarily. So to me, that's what F tier means, is that this coach is literally on the chopping block. They're about ready to get fired if they don't have a better season than they did before. I don't know that there's any coaches in the conference that are in this situation. So I did not put an F tier here. So let's get started. First up is going to be Brent Brennan from Arizona. So Brent Brennan he's going into his second year at Arizona. He came from San Jose State. I think he was a guy that I don't know that a lot of people knew. I don't think a lot of people necessarily knew what to think of him necessarily, because they just lost Jedd Fisch to Washington, and they lost just a pile of players to the portal, and a lot of them followed Jedd Fisch over to Washington. As a result, they had Noah Fifita last year and Tet McMillan, so they had a couple of really nice players, but otherwise Arizona really struggled last year. And now you lose Tet McMillan. You still have Noah Fifita, but you lose Tet McMillan, who is, arguably, he was certainly in the conversation as the best receiver in college football last year, if not the best one. Though I will say I have a soft spot for Jaden Higgins, obviously, but I think right now The tricky thing about here is that Arizona is not an easy job. It's a basketball school that, I mean, it exists in a state that has some football talent. Arizona, the state has more football talent than I think a lot of people realize. And that, like, Iowa State has gotten players from there. Brock Purdy is one of them. They've Eli Sanders out there, who's now he transferred to UNLV, or he said transferred to New Mexico, and then he has transferred to USC, I want to say. But Iowa State's pulled plenty of guys out of Arizona, and so there's talent there. But Arizona is a basketball school and not necessarily a rich one at that. And it doesn't have a history or like a culture of winning. Right now, they had a couple of good seasons with Jed Fish, but beyond that, Arizona historically is not a good football program. Or not a great one. They're an okay program, but not great. They struggled last year and they lost the best receiver in college football. I don't know that anybody expects Arizona to be a power moving forward. Does that mean, I'm not exactly sure where you go from here. If Brent Brennan could absolutely prove me wrong, maybe Noah Fifita has a Heisman contender caliber season and Arizona is an 8 or 9 win football team. And all of a sudden this looks great. But then even if that happens, you're starting to look at like, well, okay, did they just win because Noah Fifita went crazy, or is Brent Brennan a really good coach? It's pretty early to take a call on this one because we just don't know. But right now, I just don't love the prospect of I don't love the prospect of Arizona going forward with Brent Brennan. I just don't think it's not a name that moves the needle a lot in terms of generating excitement around a program. They didn't do well last year with a couple of great playmakers, and then they lost the best one, and they're not really expected to be much of anything this year. Does that mean he's, I don't think he's on the chopping block. Does that mean he'll be on the chopping block next year? I don't know. Probably not. Typically, you typically coaches at least get, 3 years, unless you're at like a remarkably impatient school like a Tennessee or something like that, where they or like an SEC school where they're gonna come after you if you're not good right away. I just don't see a lot there with Brent Brennan to make me excited about him going forward. So next up is going to be Chris Klieman with Kansas State. Now, Chris Klieman before he was at Kansas State was in the lineage of North Dakota State, and came from that program where they just won a ton of games there, won some titles, things like that. Came to Kansas State and pretty much picked up right where Bill Snyder left off. Has put some good teams on the field. They won the Big 12 title in 2022. His resume isn't. I mean, I think this is a guy that he's probably an A tier in this conference. His resume speaks for itself. I mean, he's won a conference title at Kansas State. They've been, I think 9 wins is their lowest season win total with him in Manhattan. That was this past season. I think if there is any question about Chris Klieman going forward, it's maybe how long he'll be at Kansas State. Is he, because I think he's in his late 50s. I want to say, I should actually look this up. How old is Chris Klieman? He's born in 67. So he's 58 years old. So he's in his late 50s. And you can coach into your 60s. I mean, that's not, and I would assume he will. But he's not a coach that like you're gonna sit there and like wonder where how he's still there 20 years from now. He's not. I don't think he's gonna be Bill Snyder coaching into his 80s. Is he at Kansas State for 5 more years? Is he at Kansas State for 10 more years? I don't know what the answer to that is. But for the duration that Chris Klieman is there, he will be a good coach. I guess the only thing I think that would peel him away from Kansas State, aside from retirement, would be potentially Iowa coming after him if, whenever Kirk Ferentz decides to hang it up, maybe in the next few years. Whenever Kirk Ferentz decides to hang it up, I would be pretty shocked if Iowa didn't go after Chris Klieman pretty hard. Could they offer enough to peel him away from Kansas State? I don't know. But I think it's an interesting name to talk about here because, like I said, they've been really good under Chris Klieman. Matt Campbell's beaten a bunch, but Kansas State's been really good under Chris Klieman. They, like I said, they picked up right where Bill Snyder left off. Their recruiting is in pretty good shape. They've got their quarterback for the next couple of years. in Avery Johnson. I mean, Chris Kleiman's a pretty safe A tier, I think. Um, he's got the resume to back it up and has done a nice job there in Manhattan so far, and will continue to for at least a while for sure. All right, next up is Dave Aranda at Baylor. So Dave Aranda came. He was the defensive coordinator at LSU during that during the Ed Orgeron run. You know, he was on the 2019 team that won the national title with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and Josh Jefferson and all that. You know, he took over for after Matt Rule left, and he's done an all right job. They did win the Big 12 title in 2021, which is, and I mean, winning a Big 12 title is a big deal. But since then, it hasn't been the smoothest of sailing for Baylor. You know, they've struggled the last year. They were fine. But after winning that 2021 title, they dropped down. They had a 6-7 season in 2022, and then in 2023 they were 3-9. Now, last year they rebounded absolutely to an 8-5 record, which is certainly it's good, solid, and respectable. From a 3-9 team up to an 8-5 team. And towards the end of the year, they were a solid football team that actually, just based on conference record, was actually involved in the really complicated and messy tiebreakers there towards the end of the season. So credit to him there for rebounding like that. I think Dave Aranda is a solid coach. And he seems like a nice guy. There's a number of reasons that you can have a little multi-year blip like that, where you just, you lose some talent. And I know, from what I understand, is that the NIL situation there at the beginning of the NIL era at Baylor was a little tricky for him to navigate. It's a private school, and it's a private school that has some money to back it up. But I think I think their NIL program wasn't awesome to start with, as far as getting off on the right foot. So they struggled a little bit, but they've rebounded. Now we got to see what happens, because he won a title, had a few bad years, and then rebounded last year towards the end of the season. Now, what does Baylor look like going into this year? I think it seems like they've got a quarterback. We'll see. I think right now, I think it's fine to put Baylor. I think it's fine to put Dave Aranda in the B tier, on the basis, like I said, he won a conference title. Now, a good chunk of that roster was from the carryover from the Matt Rule era. But it wasn't the next year; it was the year after. So that's worthy of note. We'll have to see. He could, if he puts together some more seasons here. Like next season, if they can go, if they can go 8-4 in the regular season or better, 9-3 or something like that, then I think he's really flirting with A tier. But just right now, those couple down years have me concerned. Just because he started off, Baylor was in a really good spot when he left off. When Matt Rule left, Baylor was in a good spot. So, he took something that was good and then it went bad, and then now it might be good again, but we're not really sure just yet. So I'm comfortable putting Dave Aranda at the B tier spot. I don't know. We'll see. I'm optimistic that he will be solid going forward, but Baylor is an interesting situation. They're not the only private school in the state. They do have, they had the run under Art Briles, and then they were terrible for a while, and then they had a good few years there under Matt Rule, and then now they're kind of back down. So like Baylor isn't some historical powerhouse. I mean, I think they're over 500 historically, but there was a long stretch there. After they left the Southwest Conference, there was a long stretch where they were one of the worst programs in college football. So it seems like the Baylor athletic program has a little bit more momentum now behind it. After the women have won a couple of national titles, the women's basketball has won a couple of national titles. The men won a national title a few years ago, and Football's won a couple of conference titles, things like that. They've got more momentum than they used to, and it sounds like the NIL ship may have been largely righted, but it's hard to tell exactly. So, it's kind of a wait and see. But Dave Aranda is probably the one most primed to jump up into the A tier, I think. Other than there's one other coach on this list that actually there's a couple other ones that I think are on the verge of being up near that A tier. But Dave Aranda is not too far away. Okay, next up is by far the most difficult one to grade here, which is Deion Sanders at Colorado. So Deion, I don't think I need to introduce Deion Sanders, I don't think. Yeah, they struggled for a few years there. They struggled his first year there at Colorado. Roster was a mess, new coaching staff, all this or whatever, and they just weren't good. Now you go to last year. Shedeur is one of the better quarterbacks, playing like one of the better quarterbacks in college football. Travis Hunter is maybe the best individual talent we've seen come through college football in the last couple decades. At least, you're talking about Travis Hunter being in the same category of just talent and good at stuff, in the same category as like a Reggie Bush and stuff like that. I mean, he was just that kind of good. He was just that good of a player. But they also had some other good ones. They had a couple of other good receivers and things like that. And the question here with Deion is now, what does he look like now that he doesn't have Shedeur Sanders at quarterback, and he doesn't have Travis Hunter playing as a Biletnikoff wide receiver in a Thorpe Award defensive back. I would argue that he probably didn't deserve to win the Biletnikoff, but I get why they gave him the trophy. Either way, and and a Heisman winner above all that. So, the question here is, what can they do? They've brought in some talent, as we kind of thought they would. They've been able to recruit. They recruited some decent players at Jackson State. Now they've recruited some big time players. They've recruited some good players into Colorado. They've got good transfers. They've got a 5-star quarterback transfer, or for 5-star cabinet. They've got a couple of options at quarterback. But the question is, what happens when they don't have those two guys available to them, and maybe their quarterback isn't accurate enough. Maybe the offensive line still hasn't been rectified. Maybe the defense is still kind of sketchy. I'm really torn on here because I think Deion Sanders can be a good coach. But right now, his record that we've seen at the Power 5 level is he was bad his first year, and he was good and they were good his second year, and in the title, in the title game hunt. But he was also the beneficiary of one of the best quarterbacks in college football, as well as the best player that college football has seen in the last 20 years. So what does that look like? I wish there was like a C.5 tier here. I wish there was a tier between B and C to account for this, because I think the ceiling for Deion at Colorado is fairly high because of how I think they can recruit there and the NIL money they've been able to generate, the season ticket sales and all that. There's so much hype around here. But he's only got 2 seasons. And the only good one came with 2 of the best college, players in college football. And there's also the idea that Deion may have his eye on the NFL whenever a job comes open. If the Browns job comes open after this coming season, is Deion going to look to leave and go coach the Browns and coach his son? Maybe. I'm not convinced that he's long for Colorado. I don't think he sees Colorado as a destination. So I think I'm going to put him. I think I'm going to put Deion Sanders in the C tier for right now, because I need to see what he can do without Shedeur and Travis Hunter available to him. And I need to see what he can do over a multi-year stretch. I'm not I think he can be good, and I think that their ceiling is higher with him there than with a lot of other candidates because of how he can recruit. And it seems like, it seems like his players really like him. Like, it seems like he is a player's coach, which makes sense. But we'll see. He is a boisterous personality that can rub a lot of that can and does rub a lot of people the wrong way. And who knows, maybe he says something dumb in a press conference next year and turns the donors against him or something. I don't know. There's a lot of red flags with Dion at Colorado that leaves me to put him in the C tier. Just because I think there's too many red flags for what could go wrong, or he could leave early or whatever. So I think that's where Deion Sanders belongs. All right. Next up, this is Joey McGuire at Texas Tech. Now, Joey McGuire is a really interesting guy to look at in this tier list because Texas Tech has become a recruiting machine under him. Their NIL has exploded. Now that helps that Texas Tech has a lot of alumni that are in the oil industry. So they've got a lot of dollars they can throw around, oil dollars that they can throw around at NIL. And he has won games. They've put together some solid teams. However, they have not really broken through yet. We haven't really seen them break through and be a real contender at the top of the conference yet, with Joey McGuire as the coach. That said, I think their roster when he took over was not in good shape. And I think he's done a good job rebuilding it. They need to stabilize that quarterback position. And they lost Taj Boyd, not Taj Boyd. They lost a couple a couple good running backs this year. We'll see. I think this is another one where I think prospectus, I think the prospectus is right now, if you're leaning towards what can happen, the potential, I think he goes into the B tier. If you're going based off of um, what he's accomplished so far, I think he's closer to C tier. I'm inclined to go with B tier here for Joey McGuire because I think he's done okay. I think he's done a solid job rebuilding that, and if they can get it figured out, and put together a good year, that Texas Tech can be a Big 12 title game contender, most years under Joey McGuire, the way he recruits. So I think the prospectus going forward lends itself to him being in that B tier. Next up, we have got Kalani Sitake, at BYU. This is another one. I'm so close to putting him. I'm close to putting him. He's not an A tier coach because I think he just hasn't won enough yet here. I think he's very solidly a B tier with, maybe as one of the guys that is most likely to be able to jump up to A tier. He's done a great job at BYU. He's been there for a long time. BYU won a ton of games when they were an independent, and now in their first year in the first couple of years in the Big 12, they the first year in the Big 12 they were in a little bit of a transition year roster wise, and they struggled a little bit. Last year, obviously, had a very good season, and arguably had they may have had an argument to be included in the playoff as an at large. And they were in the final group of tiebreakers at the right up to the 11th hour there to make it to the Big 12 title game too. So they were not eliminated that Saturday night until like right before kickoff or something like that, or like the first quarter. They were not, they were in contention into like I think through kickoff of their game that night. So however, BYU's schedule last season wasn't especially difficult. I mean, they had to play some tough opponents, but they didn't they didn't have as difficult a schedule as they could have, and they were also the beneficiary of some bounces. Now they were a good team. I'm not taking that away from BYU at all. They were a good team that had a very good defense. Um, I want to see it. I want to see it again. I want to see BYU be a 9-10 win team again before I'm ready to put Kalani Sitake um, in the A tier. I think he's earned every bit of that B tier. And I think if BYU puts up another 9-10 win football season this year, I'm comfortable moving. I'm comfortable giving some real consideration to moving Kalani Sitake up to the A tier. So a lot of respect for him, a lot of respect for the BYU football program. Let's just see a little bit more. Let's see you do it, multiple years in a row. All right, next up is Kenny Dillingham. This is an especially difficult one, especially difficult one to do, um, because of the small sample size. He is very new to the big, obviously Arizona State's only been in the conference for 1 year, but the 1 year they won the Big 12 title. So it's very difficult to argue with that. I mean, I would, the Big 12 title win isn't necessarily a requirement to be in the A tier, and it's not necessarily a guarantee that you get in the A tier, as like we saw with Dave Aranda. And it's a small sample size. However, and it's worth noting too is that they, part of that Big 12 championship was also having a ridiculous player at running back in Cam Skattebo. Now, Cam Skattebo is in the NFL. They've got skill position players returning, and they've got a good quarterback in Sam Levitt. And that's, having good quarterback play is a huge chunk of the recipe to being a consistent football team and being a consistently good football team. But, what can they do when Cam Skattebo isn't at times single-handedly dragging them to wins? We'll see. They can recruit well. I think he can recruit well. We know for a fact that Kenny Dillingham, he even said in a press conference, we know he has followed the Matt Campbell playbook as far as program building goes, making sure your culture is set in stone, recruiting to fit guys that fit your team, that fit your culture, and not just chasing recruiting stars or anything like that. I think the prospectus going forward is very good for Kenny Dillingham at Arizona State. I think he's an A tier. I'm going to put him in the A tier. However, I think he is the weakest of the A tier right now, strictly on the basis of we need to see more of him. He's a 32-year-old head football coach. And, I think Cam Skattebo in Arizona State in general caught a lot of people off guard. Now, granted, they were projected to be one of the worst teams in the conference, and they outdid that. Can't take that away from him. That's why he's in the A tier. However, I think Kenny Dillingham would probably be the one most likely that, if Arizona State is just kind of okay this season, I think he would be the one most likely to drop down to a B tier, just based on, getting more of a sample size in there. All right. Next up is Kyle Whittingham at Utah. So Kyle Whittingham has been at Utah for a very long time. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he was the one that took over for Urban Meyer after Urban Meyer left. He's been at Utah for a long, long time. Has won a lot of games, won Pac-12 titles. Got to the Big 12, and Utah was terrible. They were not a good football team. Their defense was fine, or their defense was solid, above average, maybe good. Offense was atrocious. Utah as a football team was a mess last year. They were not competitive for the entire season. Essentially, they were just not good. And the tricky part here is that the tricky part here with Kyle Whittingham is you're basically having to rank him entirely on the basis of his past resume that he did in the Pac-12 and basically the respect he had, because so far in the Big 12, Utah's been terrible. And we also know that Utah has a coach in waiting, which means that Kyle Whittingham is getting ready to retire. So I will be the first to confess that I'm not necessarily 100% locked into Utah's offseason moves and what they've gotten in the transfer portal and all this, but I don't believe Utah is expected to just jump back up to being a 10-win football program, and then all of a sudden, challenge at the top of the conference, right away this season. So, it could be it could be a rough couple first years um, in the Big 12 for Utah and for Kyle Whittingham. And the question is, beyond that, how long does he stick around? Is this going to be his last year? Is he going to get tired of the transfer portal and NIL and just decide to hang it up? You're like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. And it is what it is. We've already got a coach in waiting. So there's program stability already ready to go. He could just call it quits. I think if you'd asked me this as he was coming into the conference, I think he's a clean and easy A tier. I'm going to slide him in the B tier. And Utah fans will probably not like me for that. But you know what? I also don't care about Utah fans. You guys are assholes. But you will not find a single Utah fan amongst the other fan bases in the Big 12. They did a lot of talking. The fans did an extraordinary amount of talking about how they're going to dominate and they're going to run the league, calling it the gas station conference. And then they come in and get their ass beat their first year. Couldn't be happier to see it. Everybody in the Big 12 was rooting against you. I hope you know that.